Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Fireside Chat, The True Cost of a Data Breach. Today, we have Brian, founder and CEO of Doppler, and Nic, the engineering manager at Doppler, as our speakers. Quickly, before we get started, a few housekeeping. If you have questions, be sure to drop them in the question and answer box within Zoom. Also, we'll be sending a follow-up email of the recording of the event. And then be sure to let us know what you thought of today's event. After we end today, a post-event survey will be popping up. I'll now hand it over to Brian and Nic.
Hey all, good to be here.
Hey, everybody.
So we're going to be talking about three different parts of this conversation today. The first one's going to be around the causes of a data breach, then how we quantify some of the costs associated with it, and then what we can do to mitigate the risks in the future. Sound good to you, Nic?
Yeah, sounds perfect.
All righty. Well, why don't we jump in? Why don't you walk me through what are some of the causes of a data breach?
For sure. I think one of the clearest to point out, which is maybe one of the more obvious, is access controls. It's a term that we throw around a lot. And it's important to mention as well that, a data breach, it really could come in a lot of different forms. When you hear breach, you're thinking of something massive, like a, massive corporation leaking a bunch of credit card information, but it could be something on a much smaller scale. For example, a secret of yours turns up on some sort of site, and it's brought forth to you through like a private disclosure program, right? All of these things would be considered, in the breach category, but the impacts are big and small. So the objective of reducing the size of a breach is, certainly to reduce the impact, but then also to handle it quickly and without a lot of cost. So access controls are probably the front row to that. Making sure that users have the appropriate access to do their job, but not any further. And it's, sometimes easier said than done. A big component of that is the defaults of the service that you're using. In AWS's S3 several years ago, it was really easy to make an S3 bucket public, and it was such a massive problem that they kind of overhauled the way that they do that. So it's actually quite difficult to make an S3 bucket fully public, even to read. We've got some artifacts that we host that need to be public, and you have to check like 3 or 4 different boxes and turn off these security controls, which is excellent. That's a great thing to see. The second thing is accidental leaking, right? Like even if you've got all of the access set up appropriately, it is sometimes, unfortunately, easy to accidentally drop a password someplace where it's not supposed to go. And it's sometimes challenging when things sort of slip out of the rings of trust, right? So you've got like, a password that's in maybe your password manager, or the corollary being like a secret in your, in your secrets management system. And you're thinking about the secret in this secure space as critical, right? And then there are like sort of outside rings, like maybe Slack is like a ring that you consider to be secure, but certainly not as secure, right? But it's private, but is it? So it's when you're thinking about that, oh, is it that big of a deal to like just send this credential over to a coworker who would otherwise have access, but these are special circumstances. Surely it's just, just send it through Slack. It's not a big deal. Well, it is, because that ring is outside of this ring of trust. You've got this other service. Are they handling the data the same way that you would? Are they handling it with the same standards? Are they approved to hold that data? So even something considered, a leak sounds, again, really aggressive, like, oh, I accidentally tweeted this thing, right? But there are kind of layers to this accidental leaking that you might not be considering, because on Slack, the access controls might be different, right? There might be a Slack admin who could potentially read messages in this private channel and get access to this data that you weren't really considering before. So that's a big second component, is just accidents. And then the third one is the human factor, which is, social engineering and all of its associated friends. We are seeing this. It's been bad for a long time, but I do think AI is going to make it a lot worse. And this kind of goes back to access controls, is, you kind of want to keep things as locked down as you can, because all it takes is, one bad day for someone to go, oh, you know what, the CEO needs something, or, oh, this is an emergency, someone's messaging me about it, I should just handle this quickly and I'll take care of it. And you accidentally gave up something huge.
And going back to the accidental leak, I think there's a couple different ways that this can go down just to make it a little bit more realistic for people. So let's talk about the Slack case, and let's just say any messaging service. So not to pick on Slack in particular, Slack's a great
Right.
tool. But yeah, you send over this API key on Slack or this other messaging tool, and let's just say for some reason they're investigating something internally. So all the messages that are sent for a cohort of users are sent to a logging service. Well, now that API key went from your hands to Slack or messaging tool to now logging service. And we don't even know how that logging service is going to handle that data because that's not necessarily sensitive data. Logging data a lot of times generally isn't sensitive data. And now all of a sudden it keeps going layer by layer by layer, and you're far out of control. And it's very hard to even know what is going, like how far that secret has gone outside of the perimeter. And there's many different examples of that too. Like if you're writing code and you have your secrets in a code base, right? And then at some point you're like, I'm going to move all the secrets to secrets manager, so that we can eventually, let's just say, make this an open source project. Well, just because you moved it from the current state doesn't mean that the history doesn't contain that API key anymore. And one quick scan from a bot will immediately find that API key. And so there are a lot of different ways where you can accidentally leak secrets by not having like a strong security posture day one.
Absolutely. And one more I think is worth highlighting, which is API keys used in your own services, your own SDKs and things that might propagate out to logging or a bug tracking system, right? So you're making an API request to Slack, for example, an error gets thrown in that request, and that gets thrown out of your stack and into, a Sentry or a bug snag or some sort of tracking system, or it might even be just serialized out to your standard output so that you can investigate it further. And if that API key is embedded in the details of that request, again, you've just leaked it to this wider circle that you weren't expecting to hold your secrets. And again, maybe the security controls within that organization, like you said, if they're doing an investigation or if there's some bug that they're tracking down, they're going to go look at that and they're going to see that. And that's just another set of eyes that, should have never been on this very sensitive API key.
And just as like a reminder for everyone in the room, when we talk about secrets, we're generally talking about either passwords, API keys, database URLs, or other credentials, strings of text that grant access to systems. So if you have a piece of text this long and all of a sudden that gets out, that could mean your entire database just got out, not just this piece of text. So it's really important to keep these sensitive credentials private and well managed. And on that note, when things do go bad, it's really important to quantify the costs associated with that event that just happened, that breach. So, Nic, how do you think about quantifying the cost of a data breach?
For sure. This is interesting to think about. And the more you start thinking about it, the more you realize how widespread the impacts really are. There's kind of obvious things in the front, actual costs, like monetary costs. You might have SLAs or agreements with your users that would require some remediation. Potentially, you might be in some sort of regulatory trouble depending on your industry. So you might encounter like a fine or have to deal with legal fees, like the Equifax. Yeah, I'm sure that breach involved many many zeros of dollars to resolve. And then there's sort of like, it starts to get a little bit more abstract, right? In order to remediate this breach, there's a lot of actual work to be done, right? There's a lot of actual engineering work for identifying the problem, figuring out how big the impact is, repairing the problem. But also on the other functions of your business, like informing your users and crafting, like you're basically running a PR campaign, right? For this breach, you're going to have to reach out to people, identify the affected users, come up with the appropriate amount of transparency and language that you want to use. And then, it's an ongoing thing, right? You're probably not going to know everything off the bat. You're going to need to, send out an initial email, let folks know what's going on, and then, sort of as more becomes available, decide when to update people and how frequently, because you don't really want to draw, all this attention on yourself, but you also need to be transparent. So all of that on the business functions is effort that you could have been spending elsewhere. And then there's the operational pieces. I mentioned it takes investigation to actually do something. Well, if you discover that you've leaked a critical API key, you might not be in a position from a systems standpoint to just rotate that thing right off the bat. If that's not something that you've practiced, that your org is prepared to do, you might go, I don't know how many services are using that API key, and it wouldn't normally be safe to rotate. But now that I know that this has been leaked, that the credential that's, sending actual emails out to my users and billing them, right, is available, and we know that somebody has access to it, well, we need to shut the whole system down, right? So now you're facing, at the very minimum, service disruption, potentially hard downtime, depending on what got leaked. And that's going to sit there until you investigate the issue, until you figure out what the problem is, and you rotate the credentials, because rotating the credentials isn't going to do you much good if it can just get leaked again using the same mechanism, right? The actual forensic investigation can be massively expensive, and potentially you might be required, depending again on your industry, to bring in experts externally to investigate your systems and go through your audit logs if there is some suspicion that there was, an internal actor involved. So that's going to be, again, money and time. And then there's the reputational damage, which I think maybe you should start on, because there's a lot here too.
Yeah, on the reputational side, it's huge. I mean, there's a couple different factors I consider. One is just that why do customers trust services? They trust them to perform an outcome. And along the way, you give them data so that they can perform that outcome. And so there's like this implicit trust that, hey, if I'm going to use Uber and go from place A to B, where I went from A to B stays private. And when there's a breach, oftentimes it's not just the company that's deeply impacted, it's the customers. Like if you think about the Twitch data breach that happened, where most people's earnings went public, when people's watch history went public, that impacted a lot of people, and it impacted a lot of trust with just not just that company, but the industry as a whole. People start to question, should I trust my data, with these services? And it's very, very hard to walk that back, not just to the company, but also to the industry as a whole. So it's not, there are real people behind these data breaches that are impacted. I've been impacted, my family has, by a couple of them with password breaches, and that's, thank God we use password managers, but if we didn't, it could have been really, really bad. So that's something I kind of keep top of mind. And then on the remediation side, is another important thing. So we have a customer that before they started using Doppler, they had an internal actor that became malicious and took with them 2,000 of their secrets. And so the security team had to jump on and rotate, which is a way to revoke the old credentials and issue new ones out, to every secret that they had. And it took their security team 6 months to do that, full time. Right. So 6 months of security agenda just got thrown out the window so that they can manually, one by one, find all the different secrets that there were. And there wasn't a public or a centralized registry of where all these secrets were. So they go find them and then safely revoke and issue new ones without creating downtime. And that's 6 months of a gap where like those attackers can exploit that as well. So there was like ongoing risk to the business during that 6 month period of time. So there's a large cost to these data breaches at scale. And then one other one that I just realized recently as well is there can be legal implications too. If you look at Joe Sullivan from Uber, he got prosecuted by San Francisco and lost the case as a CISO because he did not disclose that they got that there was a data breach in a respectable amount of time. And so now, even for security professionals, there's actual legal implications as well. And that case was meant to kind of like, I think, truly scare the industry into having the right security posture.
Yeah, that's huge. That's massive.
So as we can see, there's a very large cost to these data breaches. But let's switch to a little bit of a forward-thinking topic around how do we mitigate these data breaches going forward? What are the things we can be doing?
For sure. I think the top of mind items are around planning, right? We kind of alluded to this earlier on, but all of these really bad, the things that separate a quickly handled data breach from a really prolonged battle of a data breach is going to be how well are you prepared to take the remedial actions, things like rotating credentials, being able to run investigations. How well can you go through your logs? Do you even know where the logs are going to be, right? Like if you needed to go back through and identify all of the users who have seen this or had access to this to be able to plug a leak, right? Would you be able to answer those questions, right? And maybe the answer is no, and that's an acceptable risk for you, right? Like maybe that's something that you're going to say, yeah, it's, you know, we don't have that and we want that, but, you know, here's what it's going to take to get there. And maybe you accept that risk. But a lot of businesses aren't even considering it, right? That's what's, I think, unacceptable, is you need to at least consider what risk you're taking on before you accept it. So having just, you know, a response plan for, here are some scenarios that might happen, and here's what we'll do. And then, you know, for some industries, or there are some industries that require certain controls around this, and some organizations are going to take it more seriously than others. If you've got a box to check, you might as well make it worth your while, right? If you need to have a controlling process, make it work for you, right? So if you need to do this thing, okay, well, what makes sense for our business? And let's actually be serious about it and apply it, right? And then practicing those things, right, on an annual basis or a biannual basis or monthly basis, whatever seems to mitigate the risk and the trade-off for your organization. What this concretely could look like is, okay, here's this example scenario. Let's do a roundtable and have everyone who is going to run that in the wild. Let's all sit down and figure out how long it takes us to do this, right? Like, what things do we bump into? Maybe you can do like a red team, blue team thing where you've got like some attackers who are throwing more scenarios at you, and then you're needing to respond to it. Whatever is going to work for your business. That's what's massive. What you don't want is the situation where you realize it would take you months to resolve, right? That's problematic.
And I think on that note, when it comes down to planning, I kind of bucket into two groups. It's like, what are the tools you have, and what are what are the strategies that you can deploy? And like the strategies should have that you have should match the tools that you have. And oftentimes where I see things go wrong is there's a strategy, but there's either no tools to support it or the wrong tools to support it. And when I say wrong, I mean generally those tools aren't integrated into the existing workflows you have today. So for example, we know secrets, that's our bread and butter. So I'm going to talk about that for a second. If you have a secrets manager that's not integrated into your infrastructure, when you need to start rotating secrets, you're going to have to do it manually versus click a button, everything gets rotated in 10 minutes. Your entire infrastructure gets those new secrets. There's no downtime. And it was this very painless process that was well managed versus if you go back to that story of one of our customers before they tried Doppler, it took them 6 months. And that was because it was done manually. They did have tooling in place, but the tooling wasn't integrated into their infrastructure. And that was one of the core problems. And so this is not a pitch for Doppler. This is a pitch for whatever tool you buy. That could be a password manager, making sure it's integrated in the browser, to secrets managers and so on. Make sure they're deeply integrated into your workflows so that when you do need to click the big button, you can click it and everything is automated from then on.
Absolutely. I think the second piece of this, which is kind of along the same lines, is creating a culture of security. And this is within your engineering organization and outside. This is, again, easier said than done. And it's something that, it's like any bit of your company's culture, you need to cultivate, set an example, and really show your team what you mean when you say that you want to create a security culture within the organization. This is things like having clear policies and procedures, like a sort of a see something, say something. Hey, I noticed, that this data probably shouldn't be in our bug tracker. Is there a mechanism to report that, in a way that's clear and that will end up in the hands of the right people? I mean, how often do you hear stories about things that got reported and then they just kind of sat there because it was nobody's responsibility, right? Have clear responsibilities and clear mechanisms for anyone to report a security problem. Training fits alongside that, knowing where to send things and having specialized roles, right? Finance serves an important function in the business, and the security threats that they're going to face are going to be slightly different. So try to tailor your training to the right organization beyond just, your standard corporate security training, right? We mentioned before incident response drills, huge. Security by design, this sort of breaks into within the engineering org, trying to involve security in everyone's thinking, right? It's not like there's an engineering team and a security team. Security is everyone's responsibility. We sort of saw the shift with infrastructure where with DevOps, you've got developers that are now thinking about ops. And with DevSecOps, you're thinking about, okay, now developers are also thinking about security. And security is thinking about development, right? It can't just be a one-handed, motion where, all right, we wrote the code, send it over to security to get reviewed. It needs to be part of the process. More concretely, what this actually looks like is, having developers implement the policies in code so that they can't ship things that are insecure, or the appropriate folks are automatically tapped in whenever there's a change that might require a security review. And then on the flip side, security being thoughtful about how quickly that they're going to respond to these. The faster you can get an answer turned around, the more the process is going to work, and the more that your developers are going to want to involve you in the process, right? Again, least privilege is huge, and there's a whole slew of trade-offs involved in making sure that folks have the right access for the right job function, maybe tacking on, some sort of approval process or break glass if there's a need to do so. And then sort of at the end of the pipeline, having really good auditing and assessment tools, monitoring and alerting, right? If someone uses this thing, will we get notified? Would we even know, right? Being able to answer those questions, or, those are big. And then just a dollop of healthy skepticism for the whole org, right? Whenever you get an email, whenever it's always that we got a whole channel in Slack, at Doppler, where we just share, hey, I got this phishing email today. Doesn't this look sketchy, right? Here's a screenshot. And knowing what might be out there and what risks you might be facing.
One other thing I want to add on to this, I think it was Cloudflare that pioneered this, where they made sure that when they were crafting the culture around security, that the incentives were in the right direction. For example, I've worked at companies where if you post a screenshot of this email and you say, is this a harmful email? Is this like a phishing email? They'll just be like, oh, go away. Right. And that's not the right response. The right response should be like, thank you for doing this. Thank you for having the courage to do this. Even if it isn't an issue, thank you for thinking that it could be one. And so making sure that you are constantly rewarding the good behavior of reporting things that seem wrong, or potentially could be wrong. So I think that's incredibly important. And then on the secure by design, I think this is a really important part that's like often overlooked in fast growing companies, is like, it's not just about making sure that you have that security team that's embedded in there, but like, for example, access controls. When you're setting up your product and you set up access controls for what users can do within that product, thinking about that and thinking about where all the places that's enforced. Is this where like the controls are implemented at the edge, at the API, and at the dashboard, or is it in one central place that kind of is that central authority, all your logic's there, and then aggressively testing that logic to make sure that people can't get over escalated permissions, right? That's a good example of where secure by design, because it doesn't have to be an API key breaches for you to have a data breach. It could be you have a couple invalid or wrong if statements in your permissioning model, and all of a sudden you're just giving the data away for anyone who knows how to contact that API. So it's important to be really thoughtful and take a holistic strategy to mitigating the risk of a data breach. But let's look a little bit more forward. What are some of the future trends that you're excited about, Nic, that can help mitigate the risks?
Absolutely. I'm particularly excited about automating more of that incident response and making that process easier, right? At Doppler, I think we've got some really good processes in place, but they're mostly scripts, right? They're mostly run books. Okay, here's the situation. Assign these roles to these people, get everyone around the table and start, executing on these specific items, right? And a lot of those things are, okay, now go into GCP and click around in here, right? Oh, it looks like they moved something. Okay, well, they didn't get rid of the feature, so where is it now, right? That's problematic, right? That's what's going to what's going to hurt you in the moment. And again, that's why you test, right? If a tool changes something, okay, update your screenshots because that's over here now, or try your scripts because there's the script's giving me a 403. Well, now I got to figure out what the permissioning is for this. So avoiding those things by automating more, and tooling again is sort of doing that up front for you, streamlining those sort of the manual operations in the heat of the moment is the number one thing. And this could be the difference between you handling an incident in like 5 to 10 minutes and having the effect size really small versus several hours or days, or potentially even more, because you don't know where to look, right? That's huge. And then again, on the back end, improvements in auditing. I think there are a few things I think at the moment where we would be able to really look back at the audit history without seeing something in a monospace font, right? And that means that we're churning through like some sort of log in Stackdriver or something. We're going to have to be really combing, or looking in our database logs, or looking somewhere where it's not really set up for us to really analyze effectively. So improvements in those areas is going to be huge.
I think a couple others that I'm passionate about as well is the move to like identity-based authentication. We're seeing it in the passwords world right now, where we're removing static passwords for passkeys. I'm sure some of you guys have already seen this. And that's great, right? There's now not this password that can get breached. It's more closely tied to your identity. And identity-based authentication is also happening in secrets. It's happening right now in the infrastructure layer, like in AWS, GCP, and Azure. But more over time, we want to be part of the guiding force that helps make that an industry-wide thing. So you can authenticate into Stripe or Twilio or any other service just by your identity and not by this static API key. I think a good first step in that is like automated secrets rotation, and over time we can help transition the world further past that. And then the other thing is around regulation. I think that SOC 2 and other compliance and regulatory bodies should have stronger requirements around secrets management. It's one of the most obvious places I think that they can dramatically improve the security posture of most companies, especially as there's like that dependency chain where if I have SOC 2, all my vendors have to have SOC 2. Creates a nice ripple effect where it can really improve the security posture of the entire industry quite quickly.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see regulations with teeth, right? Like,
Yes.
actual consequences and actual useful controls that suit your business, right? It doesn't really help if, it says, oh, are all your Windows patches up to date, right? But yep, we don't use Windows, so that's checked, right? So like having appropriate controls that actually meet your needs and that make sense for your business, that you can say, yeah, you know what, I actually do feel good that we're meeting these requirements, and that when you're analyzing a vendor and they say we've got this compliance and we're serious about it, that that they're meeting a high bar.
Well, I know we've been talking a lot. I want to open it up for anyone who has any questions. If feel free to drop it in the Q&A section in Zoom, and we'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, it looks like we have one. So this one comes in: how can organizations balance providing employees with the necessary access to do their jobs effectively while minimizing the risk of unauthorized access?
Oh, that's an in-depth question. Nick, you want to take the first part, and I'll carry on afterwards?
Yeah, I would definitely say that this is more art than science. There have been times in our organization where we've really gone on one end of the spectrum, or we've tried being a little bit more in the middle. But ultimately, yeah, there's a need to balance, the ability of your team to do their job against having important access to things. For the most part, I think it's about identifying like the roles in your business, right? And figuring out, okay, what are folks doing on a day-to-day basis, and are we okay handing the reins over, right? What's the worst case scenario in giving this group of users access, and what's the likelihood of that risk? Again, it's all about like, do you actually understand what could go wrong by giving someone access to your infrastructure, for example, right? That seems like maybe a bar that's too high. That should be behind some sort of approval process. And then this is sort of the other half. If you can implement sort of like an access review process, you can significantly mitigate your risk. Now, not everything works this way, right? Like, if you've got some system, that you don't own, then it's hard to implement like an access review process. But wherever you can, it is helpful to implement, just like a 2-key style system. Internally at Doppler, our internal tools for we don't have any mechanisms for viewing user secrets, but we do have some important mechanisms for, like, for example, upgrading and downgrading a user's plan, which in the wrong hands, it could involve a disruption of service. So an individual can't take that action. They can submit a request to change the plan of a workplace, but it needs to get approved by someone with access. So, and even those approvers wouldn't be able to do it on their own. So you should sort of need, you need at least one other person to work with you to accomplish, which significantly reduces the risk. Wherever possible, using RBAC and groups to make sure that you've got you're not making these decisions on a case-by-case basis. Kind of goes back to like the roles thing, right? Of like, if it's a finance function, like these are the abilities that a finance analyst should have, or a finance admin should have, and not to like say, oh, this is a special circumstance. That should be few and far between, right? Because that's when you really get into trouble. Was there anything else you wanted to add there, Brian?
Yeah, I think one other, we've talked about this a little bit already, but around the culture of it all, right? If, let's just say for whatever reason, someone doesn't have the access they need to actually perform the duties of their role, It shouldn't feel like this extremely strong, heavy-handed process to get that access, or a scary, daunting process. I remember working at much larger companies where you'd have to contact the security team, and that was a very scary process. And then what was I incentivized to do? I was incentivized not to speak up, and then not really be able to achieve my goals and have to explain that to my manager. And so I think it's important that when there is a misalignment between what access they need and the access that they have, you do have a very smooth process to give them that access, and then adjust going forward to make sure that anyone else who is struggling for the same thing gets updated as well.
Yeah, really, really good points.
I think we have time for just one last question. Can you elaborate on the role of automation in accelerating incident response, particularly in scenarios involving secrets management, and how organizations can ensure the accuracy and reliability of automated responses?
I could take a first crack at that. Yeah, automation is great, like as an engineer, it's like automate everything, right? But it can be scary as well. You want to make sure that the things you're automating are actually useful. So you want to be automating the functions, not the plan itself, right? You don't want to, like, I mean, if you can avoid the incident altogether, absolutely do that, right? Automate as much as you can on the front end. But in the actual heat of the moment, it's about being able to say, okay, here are the steps I need to take. Okay, fire this thing off, get the inputs back and say, or the outputs rather, and go, okay, did it work? Okay, move on to the next step. So the lag time, as you probably experienced if you've ever been, like, up at 3 a.m. handling even a non-security incident, like an infrastructure incident, it's the time in the middle that takes forever, right? Oh, I don't have the appropriate access. How do I break glass? Oh, okay, well, I can't actually get into the cluster directly. I need to make a bastion. Like all of these things. Like, how do I do that? Okay, this doc's out of date, right? Bad, right? Like that's all, but like that's what's going to lose you the time. Like the actual operation of someone just needs to go in there and undelete this data, right? Or someone just needs to go in here and recover this backup, and then we'll be good to go. Yeah, it sounds super easy. It's going to take 5 minutes. Right? No, it's going to take you an hour and a half to actually get in there with the appropriate people and check the right boxes. So that's why practice makes perfect. And at least in my opinion, I think the industry is moving that way as well. And those functions are easy to test out, right? If you've got a script that creates a bastion, for example, you can test that. Did it create the bastion? Yeah. Am I in the cluster? Yep. All green, right? Versus having to test out the full plan could be really, that might be something you do like, once a year. Whereas you could test the, script for making a bastion anytime.
I actually want to add on to that because
Yeah.
I think there's like a really interesting point that you raised there around automating the functions, but not the entire plan itself. I've had times where I've tried to automate the entire plan, and the problem is it fails halfway through, and they have to figure out why it failed. And now you're debugging that instead of the root issue. You probably are also left in like this messy state that you have to clean up first before you can get back to actually solving the root problem you were trying to solve. So that's a really good point on automating the functions and then doing the rest manually, because it allows you kind of course correct in real time.
Yeah, if you're not going to run it every day, then it's gonna break in the middle. Like we've got, internally at Doppler, this script that will like set up your whole, new MacBook for you. It's called like local_setup, right? SH, right? And you were supposed to run this thing, and it's gonna like brew install everything you need, and then it's gonna like, set up your, all your containers and everything. And like you're on your first day as an engineer, you get your laptop and you run that script and it fails. And your first PR is fixing that script. And fortunately, we've got engineers who have access to their local machines. But that's not an operation that you want to be doing in production. Like you said, if it fails halfway through, you're like, well, geez, like now I'm leaving the script because I've got to go figure out how to run half of it.
Yeah, and then you also have to go figure out why it failed, and it just adds so much time, and also like mental resources that you're now solving. It feels like you have to solve two problems instead of one problem, when only one problem is really that urgent.
Yeah, it's always weighing like how often are you really doing this, right? Like and what do you want to solve? A lot of times, if I clicked a button that was like solve incident, and it ran the analysis and and produced all the audit reports, and like it was done, I'd be like, I don't know about that. I'd be looking through it anyway to at each step to make sure that the outputs match what I expected.
Yeah, that is fair.
Great. Well, thank you, Brian and Nick, for joining us today. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us. We'll be sending out this recording later this week, and catch us on our next webinar, Fireside Chat. We can't wait to see you there.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.